For over 160 years, the Catholic Church has tried to bury a secret 23 nuns, vanished, no bodies, no farewells, no explanations. No funerals were held, no families notified, just empty beds folded habits, and a silence so heavy it settled like fog over St. Mary's Convent on the misty shores of Lake Michigan, Wisconsin. Between 1854 and 1862, as Catholicism sought to expand its influence across America's Protestant frontier, a remote convent was founded under the noble promise of sheltering orphans, healing the sick, and serving God's will. But beneath the cold limestone walls of St. Mary's, something unspeakable began to fester. Locals whispered of strange noises at night. Children ran past the grounds terrified of the sad women in black watching silently from the windows. And then one March morning in 1857, a folded piece of paper slipped into the pocket of a milk boy, shattered the church's carefully built silence. It was a plea, a desperate cry for help, written by a young nun too frightened to speak, too brave to stay quiet any longer. That letter would spark an investigation that ripped the veil off one of the most horrifying cover-ups in American religious history. What followed was not just scandal, but revelation of human trafficking, systematic abuse, and a conspiracy operating behind sacred walls. This is not fiction. This is the story they were never supposed to let you hear. And it begins with a whisper that refused to be buried. The story of St. Mary's begins not in silence, but in ambition. It was 1854, and the frontier of Wisconsin was still wild, dense forests, scattered Protestant towns, and rough roads carved by immigrant labor. The Catholic Church saw opportunity in this unsettled land, a chance to expand its spiritual empire across a Protestant-dominated landscape. At the edge of Lake Michigan, they purchased a grand estate, once the mansion of a wealthy lumber baron, and turned it into a convent. Its limestone walls, arched windows, and looming bell tower stood in stark contrast to the modest wooden churches of the region. From the beginning, suspicion surrounded St. Mary's. The locals, primarily German and Scandinavian Protestants, viewed the black-robed nuns with wariness. To them, Catholicism was a religion of secrets, rituals, and foreign tongues. Their own churches emphasized simplicity and democracy. The hierarchy and mystique of the Catholic order felt dangerous. Papists, they muttered, watching the nuns enter the chapel. They'll corrupt our children. Into this tense setting arrived Mother Catherine, a tall, commanding woman with sharp blue eyes and an air of absolute control. She introduced herself as the new spiritual leader of St. Mary's, accompanied by Sister Margaret, a stern herbalist, and Sister Elizabeth, a gentle-faced woman tasked with running the orphanage. Alongside them were 20 young Irish nuns, idealistic, wide-eyed, many barely past girlhood. They had crossed the ocean to serve God. Instead, they would walk into something far darker than any of them could have imagined. It began with a missing face at morning prayers. Sister Agnes O'Connor had been one of the most beloved among the novices, only 23, with a delicate voice, soft Irish lilt, and a childlike faith that touched even the most hardened sisters. She adored the orphaned children, often slipping them extra bread when no one was watching, and wrote home faithfully every month, her careful handwriting full of awe and longing for the green hills of County Clare. But on an early April morning in 1855, her place in the chapel stood empty. The sisters noticed immediately. 20 novices should have lined the pews, but only 19 voices echoed in Latin through the cold stone hall. At breakfast, Mother Catherine's voice rang calm and final. Sister Agnes has been called to assist our mission in Minnesota. Her calling was urgent. Let us pray for her safe journey. There was no luggage, no farewell, no mention of her transfer in her last letter home. Her wool cloak still hung on its peg. Her rosary wooden beads, worn smooth by devotion, was still tucked beneath her pillow. Then came Sister Bernardet, then Sister Catherine, then Sister Josephine. One by one, they vanished, always young, always gentle, often strikingly beautiful. And always after some small infraction, a cough during silence, a tear during prayer, a moment of hesitance during confession. These became excuses for discipline, nights of fasting, isolation hours, kneeling on cold stone, or being locked alone in the old storage room behind the chapel. Afterward, they simply disappeared. Personal items remained like relics: an unfinished letter, a half-mended hem, a bit of dried lavender tucked under a pillow. There was no record of travel, no proof of reassignment. Only Mother Catherine's unwavering declarations that each one had been called elsewhere. But the sisters began to whisper in the dark. Why were only the most gentle, the most devout, the most physically striking being chosen? And if this truly was God's will, why did it feel so much like fear? Sister Mary Collins had always been quiet, observant, the kind of nun who followed rules not out of fear, but because she genuinely believed in the goodness of obedience. She kept her head bowed during prayers, her hands steady during chores, and her questions tucked safely away. But after the fourth disappearance, something inside her shifted. She began to notice things she hadn't before. The way Mother Catherine's footsteps never echoed. The way Sister Margaret's fingers lingered too long on the medicinal bottles, always measuring, always watching. The way Sister Elizabeth, once warm and kind, had grown distant, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. And then there were the sounds. Late at night, as the convent fell into prayerful silence, Mary sometimes heard muffled cries beyond the stone walls. Not the holy moans of spiritual mortification, as Mother Catherine claimed, but something else, something desperate. One night she heard a voice she recognized, Sister Josephine begging in the dark, "Please, don't take me, please," followed by shuffling feet. Then silence. Mary pressed her hand to her mouth and didn't sleep again for 3 nights. Her moment of courage came not with a plan, but with a whisper. During her weekly task of gathering eggs from the hen house, the only time she was briefly unsupervised, she saw Jimmy Fletcher, the 12-year-old farm boy who delivered milk each morning. With trembling hands, she slipped a folded note into his coat pocket, pressing her silver confirmation cross into his palm. "Please," she whispered, "take this to Father Thomas at St. Joseph's Church. Say nothing to anyone." Jimmy's freckles paled, but he nodded. That note, scribbled in the small, slanted script of a terrified young woman, would change everything. Something evil is happening at St. Mary's. Nuns are disappearing, not sent away, gone. I fear for my life. Please send help. It was no longer just whispers in the dark. It was a warning, and it would finally reach someone who dared to listen. Father Thomas Ryan was not the kind of man the church feared. He was young, soft-spoken, barely 5 years into his priesthood, assigned to a quiet parish near the edge of town. But when he unfolded the letter Sister Mary had written, with its shaky handwriting and the small silver cross attached, something in his heart shifted from reverence to resolve. He had suspected something for months. Every time he visited St. Mary's to offer Mass, he noticed fewer nuns in the pews. The Mother Superior's explanations were always the same: transferred, called elsewhere on retreat. But the stories felt thin. The eyes of the remaining sisters seemed heavier, hollowed. Still, Father Ryan hesitated. To accuse a convent of wrongdoing was no small thing. The church was building its power in the region, and Mother Catherine was one of its biggest benefactors. Her regular donations to the new cathedral fund had not gone unnoticed. Bishop Henny, his superior, had once praised her as a pillar of divine womanhood. But this letter changed everything, rather than confront the bishop who had already dismissed his prior concerns. Father Ryan made a quiet journey east to New York. There he met with Archbishop John Hughes, a man known for his intolerance of corruption. Ryan presented the letter, the cross, and his testimony. Archbishop Hughes listened in silence. Then, without delay, he summoned his most trusted investigator, Monsignor Patrick Kelly, and authorized an unannounced inspection of St. Mary's. No warning would be given, no chance to hide. By the time Father Ryan returned to Wisconsin, the plan was in motion. The church would finally look beyond incense and iconography into the dark halls of a house that claimed to be holy, and what they would find behind those doors would shatter everything they thought they knew about faith power and the cost of silence. April 17th, 1858. The day the walls began to crack, Monsignor Patrick Kelly arrived at St. Mary's unannounced, flanked by Father Ryan and 2 senior priests from neighboring parishes. The spring air was crisp, but inside the convent a storm was already brewing. Ravens circled the bell tower. Nuns scrambled in the hallways. Through an open window, Father Ryan caught a glimpse of 2 novices carrying stacks of papers toward the kitchen stove, where smoke already curled despite the warm weather. They were burning evidence. Mother Catherine, usually composed and commanding, greeted them at the door with a tight smile and flushed cheeks. "This is highly irregular," she said, voice brittle. "We require notice for such visits. Bishop Henny always gives us time to prepare." "That is exactly why we did not inform you," Monsignor Kelly replied, producing a letter sealed with Archbishop Hughes's crest. "We are to inspect all records, all quarters, all residents, no exceptions." Mother Catherine's eye flicked toward Sister Margaret, who stood motionless in the shadows of the hallway. Then with forced grace, she stepped aside. The priests split into teams, some to review records, others to speak with the remaining nuns. But Kelly and Ryan made their way straight to the north wing. The corridor was dim, lined with heavy wooden doors. At the end was one unlike the rest, reinforced with iron locked tight. Sister Elizabeth appeared, blocking their path. Her usual softness had hardened. "Mother Catherine has forbidden entry here. Some sisters are in spiritual retreat. Open it," Monsignor Kelly ordered. "Now." For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with a shaking hand, Sister Elizabeth stepped aside. The door creaked open. Inside, 5 women lay huddled in darkness. One was pregnant. All were bruised, starved, and barefoot, their habits torn. The stench of human suffering filled the air. And then, barely audible, Father Ryan, "You came back. They were preparing us for the doctor." What the priests had uncovered was not a convent. It was a prison. And it was just the beginning. While Father Ryan and Monsignor Kelly tended to the 5 rescued women, the other priests began combing through the convent's records. What they found would send shockwaves through every level of the church. Hidden behind a false wall in Sister Margaret's infirmary was a narrow staircase leading to a cramped storage room, her private quarters. Inside were shelves lined with apothecary bottles, laudanum chloroform sedatives, none of which were recorded in official inventories. Beside them sat a leather-bound journal. It was not a book of faith. Each page held clinical entries documenting subjects, their temperament, physical condition, and market value. Names were matched with coded references. Transferred Sister Agnes, May 1855, $400. Package delivered to Chicago. Condition excellent. Further entries revealed a horrifying hierarchy. Virgins fetched higher prices. Pregnant women commanded premiums. Those deemed unsuitable were simply marked terminated. At the same time, a second team of priests uncovered a hidden safe in Mother Catherine's study. Inside were ledgers revealing vast sums of money, far beyond what a convent could earn through donations or charitable work. Most disturbing were line items labeled special commissions, each corresponding with the date a nun had vanished. It became clear St. Mary's was not just a religious institution, it was a front for human trafficking. Clients included doctors, judges, businessmen, even clergy. A web of power and privilege feeding off innocence, cloaked in sanctity. Down in the chapel, Sister Mary stood silently, her knuckles white around her rosary, as she watched her world crumble. The truths she had feared to speak were now undeniable, laid bare across pages soaked in ink and blood. "I told them," she whispered. "I told them no one would believe me." Monsignor Kelly turned the page to one final entry. Sister Teresa Donovan resisted. Terminated. No commission. Buried northeast garden plot. A breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just corruption. It was systematic, calculated evil. And the church had unknowingly baptized it. By sunset, the once silent convent grounds had become a crime scene. Guided by Sister Elizabeth's stolen ledger and Sister Clare's trembling testimony, Monsignor Kelly and local authorities moved toward the vegetable garden behind the chapel, a place once praised by visitors for its thriving beans and herbs. But beneath the rows of tilled soil, something far more sinister was buried. The priests dug first. No one spoke, not even Father Ryan, whose hands shook as he gripped the spade. An hour later, the first remains were uncovered bones curled in a fetal position, shrouded in fragments of a black habit. Clutched to the ribs was a small wooden rosary, identical to the one Sister Agnes had carried. Over the next several hours, 3 more bodies were found. One bore the unmistakable red stitching of Sister Teresa Donovan's monogrammed sleeves. Another, more recent, was identified by a medallion of St. Brigid's Sister Mary Collins, the brave voice who had sparked it all. Her soil was still damp. She had been murdered shortly after sending the letter. The garden, once a symbol of life and healing, was revealed to be a burial ground for those who resisted. Each shallow grave testified to a final act of defiance, a refusal to disappear quietly. Nearby, Sister Clare collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Mother Catherine made us watch, she choked. She said it was obedience, that if we spoke we'd end up the same. The priests fell silent. There was no prayer strong enough to cover what they had found, no doctrine to explain how sacred hands had become instruments of horror. The next morning, guards were posted, the convent sealed. The women responsible, Mother Catherine, Sister Margaret, were placed under ecclesiastical arrest, confined to their cells, pending civil investigation. But when officials arrived the following dawn, their cells were empty. The doors locked from the inside, no footprints, no answers. Only silence, and the freshly dug earth that refused to forget. By dawn, the convent had become a fortress. Armed guards patrolled the grounds. Church officials stood grim-faced at every door. But even with the walls secured, evil had already slipped through the cracks. Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret were gone. Their cells were undisturbed, the windows locked from the inside. There were no broken latches, no signs of struggle, only neatly folded habits resting on their cots and the faint scent of candle smoke in the air. Panic set in. Sister Elizabeth was found in the chapel, kneeling before the altar, unmoving. Her eyes stared forward, blank and glassy, her lips silently mouthing prayers. No one could hear. When Monsignor Kelly approached, she whispered just one sentence. "He's coming. I betrayed him." She would never speak again. A search of the convent revealed a hidden passage, a narrow tunnel carved behind the north wing, likely a remnant of the estate's days as a lumber baron's mansion. Authorities followed its winding path into the woods, but it split at multiple forks and emerged near the edge of town. By then, Mother Catherine and Sister Margaret were long gone. Only Callahan the enforcer was still at large, seen boarding a night train bound for Chicago. 6 months later, he was arrested during a brothel raid. He confessed to his role in the St. Mary's operation, admitting to assaults, intimidation, and burial of inconvenient sisters. When asked where the women had gone, he smiled grimly. They planned this. New names, new cities, new uniforms. They've done it before. And when pressed about the mysterious figure referred to in Sister Elizabeth's ramblings, the master, his demeanor shifted. Eyes darting, voice low, he warned, "Don't ask about him. He's not someone you find. He finds you." Callahan was hanged for an unrelated murder. The others were never found. The silence around St. Mary's began to grow, not just from fear, but from design. What had been uncovered was too dangerous, too damning. And there were still those willing to make sure it stayed buried. The horrors at St. Mary's could no longer be denied. Bodies had been unearthed. Victims had spoken. Ledgers, letters, and journals exposed a hidden economy of suffering behind sacred walls. But as the dust settled, the church, so quick to condemn sin in the world, turned inward and turned silent. Bishop Henney was quietly reassigned to a monastery in Europe. His departure was framed as retirement for spiritual reflection, but internal memos later revealed he had received no fewer than 7 warnings about St. Mary's, each followed by a large donation from Mother Catherine to the Cathedral Fund. In one letter, he even dismissed a blood-stained habit found in the woods as a theatrical garment used during penitential rites. No public charges were filed against high-ranking clergy. No sermons were given in honor of the dead. Instead, the buildings of St. Mary's were demolished within the year. The land was sold and developed. No plaque, no memorial. Only a private ceremony attended by Monsignor Kelly and Archbishop Hughes quietly deconsecrated the soil that held so many forgotten voices. The surviving nuns were scattered to distant convents. Each was required to sign a confidentiality agreement. To speak would mean excommunication. Most remained silent until death. Sister Josephine, who had given birth after her rescue, was denied the right to raise her child. The girl was adopted out under a false name, her origins erased. Josephine died by suicide 3 years later, leaving a single line in her final note: "I cannot forgive the Church or myself." Sister Mary Collins, whose letter had exposed it all, was never honored. Not by Rome, not by her diocese. She became a ghost story in a village that chose to forget. In the Church's eyes, the matter was closed, but in the hearts of those who saw what lay beneath the stone and Scripture, it had only begun. A truth like this doesn't die with silence. It waits for memory, for justice, for someone brave enough to speak again. Though the Church had turned the page, not everyone forgot. In a small farmhouse on the outskirts of Wisconsin, the Fletcher family descendants of young Jimmy the milk boy, who delivered Sister Mary's letter, kept a quiet vigil of memory. For 5 generations, a simple wooden shelf above their kitchen stove displayed a single silver cross and a handwritten list of names: Sister Agnes, Sister Bernardet, Sister Mary, Sister Teresa. They lived, Grandpa Fletcher used to say, and they mattered. In Kikadat. 1880, Sister Anne Sullivan, one of the 5 women rescued from the locked room, wrote a letter she could never send. Addressed to the grown daughter of Sister Josephine Brady, the child taken from her mother at birth, it was found decades later in a box of convent archives. "If you ever learn of your origins," she wrote, "know this: your mother was not shamed, but brave. The true convent was not the building, but the bond between women who whispered prayers in the dark and held hands when no one else saw." Sister Rebecca, who had been renamed Rachel Martin, refused to stay silent. She left religious life, moved to California, and published a book titled The Dark Convent in 1865. Though it was denounced as Protestant fiction and quickly suppressed, its surviving copies tell the same story, unearthed by the Church's own investigation, word for word. Father Ryan, the priest who dared to speak, was sent to a remote parish in northern Minnesota. He died alone in 1886. In his journal's final entry, he wrote, "I still dream of their faces. I still hear them whispering. The Church may forget, the world may forget, but I will not, and neither should we." Because the legacy of St. Mary's isn't just one of horror. It's the story of those who tried to stop it, those who risked everything to speak, and those who, even when the world begged them to stay silent, chose remembrance over peace. Over a century later, the ground where St. Mary's once stood has been reclaimed by suburban life cul-de-sacs, trimmed lawns, laughter of children who will never know the story, buried beneath their feet. There is no monument, no plaque, no official acknowledgement of what happened there between 1854 and 1862. But some things refuse to stay buried. In 2018, during excavation for a new housing development, workers unearthed a small, rusted tin box. Inside were a folded veil, a broken rosary, and a torn piece of parchment listing 23 names. On the back, in faded ink, just 2 words: "Remember us." The box now sits uncatalogued and locked away in diocesan archives. No press release, no inquiry. Just quiet storage behind layers of institutional dust. And yet every spring, a stranger leaves white lilies at the edge of a public sidewalk where the convent garden once bloomed and where unmarked graves were paved over by driveways. Locals whisper that it's a descendant of Sister Mary Collins. Others say it's Jimmy Fletcher's great-granddaughter. No one knows for sure, but someone remembers. And that perhaps is the most radical act of all. In a world so quick to move on, so eager to cover what it cannot explain, remembrance becomes resistance. The story of St. Mary's is not just about the horror inflicted, it's about the courage it took to speak the lives it cost to be heard, and the price of silence when institutions protect themselves instead of the innocent. There may never be justice, but there can be memory. So, if you've read this far, know this: the names of Sister Agnes, Sister Josephine, Sister Mary, and all the others, they are real. Their suffering was real. Their voices, though buried, still echo beneath the soil. And now, because of you, they will not be forgotten.